Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where the past is not just remembered, but brought back to life with depth and clarity. In classical Athens, a city celebrated as the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and art, another reality existed just beyond the marble columns and public squares. It was a world rarely acknowledged in heroic histories, the world of enslaved women forced into prostitution. In the crowded brothels scattered across the city, a night with a woman could cost little more than a few barley flatbreads or a jug of cheap wine. These women were known as pornai, a term that reduced human beings to commodities, discussed and traded with the same indifference as grain or oil. Court speeches and legal records from the era reveal the scale of exploitation. Writers such as Dio and Lysias imply that many of these women were forced to serve numerous men each day, often earning barely enough to survive. Whatever small income they generated rarely benefited them. Brothel owners collected the profits, while a portion was paid directly to the Athenian state through taxes. In this way, the exploitation of women quietly became part of the city's economy. Athenian law placed virtually no restrictions on entry into prostitution. There was no minimum age. Archaeological evidence and surviving texts suggest that girls barely into adolescence were trafficked into these establishments. Many were enslaved foreigners, war captives, or children sold by desperate families. Each enslaved woman was marked as property, sometimes permanently, through branding or other visible signs of ownership. These marks ensured that escape would never truly mean freedom. Life inside these brothels was harsh and relentlessly controlled. Refusal to work was not an option. Punishments ranged from deprivation of food to public beatings meant to terrify others into obedience. New arrivals were subjected to deliberate acts of humiliation, designed to strip away any remaining sense of identity or resistance. Ancient accounts describe these practices coldly, revealing a system engineered to break the human spirit. Privacy did not exist. Women worked in shared rooms, separated only by thin curtains or mats. Sounds of suffering blended into the background noise of daily business. To many patrons, this cruelty was not disturbing, it was entertainment. New girls were considered especially valuable, and demand for them was high. Contemporary writers describe these transactions casually, as though discussing the purchase of fresh produce in the marketplace. Brothel owners categorized women based on physical traits, origins, or perceived behavior. Certain groups were marketed to specific customers, each with its own price. Art from the 5th century BCE even depicts disturbing scenes suggesting competitive violence framed as amusement. Graffiti scratched into brothel walls reveals customers boasting of brutality, treating suffering as a luxury service. Religious festivals brought no relief. During certain celebrations, prostitution was framed as ritual participation. Surviving descriptions portray these events as chaotic, fueled by alcohol and sanctioned cruelty. The language used by ancient writers shows no shame, only acceptance. Medical texts from the period quietly note injuries and deaths associated with these practices, recording them as facts rather than tragedies. Daily life offered little mercy. Punishments were arbitrary and cruel. A minor mistake, a spilled cup, a misstep, a moment of visible distress could result in severe consequences. Some women were locked away in darkness for days. Others were left exposed to the elements as a form of discipline. These methods were cynically described as correction. Escape was nearly impossible. Under Athenian law, an enslaved woman who fled was not seeking freedom. She was committing theft against her owner. Captured runaways faced brutal public punishment intended to deter others. Even sacred spaces offered no protection. Temples that should have represented sanctuary often returned women to their owners in exchange for payment. Few survived long. Ancient medical writings suggest that many died young, worn down by illness, untreated injuries, exhaustion, and malnutrition. Women who became too weak to work were discarded without ceremony. Archaeological evidence supports this grim reality. Damaged skeletons, broken bones, and remains buried without markers beyond the city walls. Pregnancy was treated as damage to property. Owners sought to prevent births through dangerous means. Childbirth, when it occurred, was unsanitary and often fatal. Infants rarely survived. Excavations near ancient brothel sites have uncovered remains discarded among refuse, silent proof of lives deemed worthless. Even the rare woman who gained freedom carried a permanent social stain. Former prostitutes were excluded from respectable life, their past erasing any chance of dignity or belonging. Death offered no honor. Without family or legal standing, their bodies were disposed of anonymously, denied burial rights afforded even the poorest citizens. Meanwhile, Athenian culture flourished. Philosophers debated virtue, playwrights entertained crowds, artists perfected the human form, yet violence against women was normalized, mocked in comedy, painted on pottery, and consumed as spectacle. The suffering of enslaved women became invisible through familiarity. The wealth of Athens did not come solely from trade or silver mines. It was supported by systems of exploitation woven quietly into daily life. While democracy thrived for some, countless women live and died without rights, names, or memory. Their absence from history is not silence, it is erasure. But in the ruins of Athens, traces remain. Broken inscriptions, discarded bones, and faint graffiti whisper of lives once lived under unbearable cruelty. Their stories deserve to be remembered. Yet the suffering of enslaved women in Athens did not exist in isolation. It was reinforced by law, philosophy, and social custom, all working together to normalize what should have been unthinkable. Athenian thinkers often debated ethics, justice, and virtue, but these discussions rarely extended to enslaved women. In philosophical texts, they appear only as background objects, tools of pleasure, labor, or punishment, never as moral subjects worthy of compassion. The legal system further cemented this dehumanization. Enslaved women were denied legal personhood entirely. They could not testify in court unless subjected to torture first, under the belief that pain alone could extract truth from a slave. This practice reveals how deeply cruelty was embedded into the very structure of justice. A woman's suffering was not evidence of injustice, it was a legal instrument. Brothel owners exploited this system to its fullest extent. They used fabricated debts to keep women permanently trapped. Charges for food, clothing, bedding, or even punishment itself were added daily, ensuring that freedom remained mathematically impossible. No matter how much a woman earned, she was always considered indebted, always owned. The public rarely questioned this system because it benefited everyone involved. Brothels provided cheap pleasure, steady tax revenue, and a convenient outlet for violence that might otherwise disrupt public order. By confining cruelty to hidden rooms, Athenian society preserved the illusion of moral superiority in its public life. Even families participated indirectly. Some impoverished households sold daughters into prostitution under the guise of survival. War captives flooded the market after military campaigns, making human life cheaper with every conquest. Women from distant lands, unable to speak Greek, were especially vulnerable. Their silence made them easier to control, easier to abuse, and easier to forget. Religion, which might have offered protection, often reinforced the system instead. Certain rituals framed exploitation as sacred tradition. By cloaking violence in divine approval, responsibility was removed from human hands. Priests, patrons, and politicians all shared in the profits while claiming moral distance from the acts themselves. Cultural storytelling further distorted reality. Playwrights depicted enslaved women as willing participants or comic figures, turning suffering into laughter. Audiences learned to view pain as entertainment rather than tragedy. Over time, repetition dulled empathy. What was once shocking became normal. What was normal became invisible. Yet beneath this enforced silence, resistance still exists. Ted. Quiet, desperate, and rarely recorded. Some women formed bonds with each other, sharing food, warnings, or brief moments of care. Others attempted escape, despite knowing the likely consequences. A few left marks behind, scratched names, symbols, or prayers hidden in walls, fragile evidence of identity in a world determined to erase it. Archaeology has begun to uncover these fragments, faint inscriptions, worn tools, burial sites that do not match official records. Together, they challenge the polished image of classical Athens. They remind us that civilization and cruelty often grow side by side. When modern narratives praise Athens as the cradle of democracy, they often omit who that democracy excluded. Women, slaves, the poor, the very people whose labor and suffering made the city possible. Freedom for some was built on bondage for others. Remembering these women is not about condemning the past with modern values. It is about acknowledging the full truth of history, the brilliance and the brutality together. Empires are not only measured by their monuments, but by how they treated the powerless. The voices of these women were silenced in life, but history still carries their echo. Every broken bone uncovered, every discarded child's remains, every erased name forces us to confront a question: what kind of greatness requires so much suffering? Their story does not weaken history, it deepens it. As centuries passed, the stones of Athens endured, but the lives the women who suffered within its walls did not. Time buried their names, erased their faces, and softened the memory of their pain. What survived was a carefully curated image of the ancient world, one of reason, beauty, and progress, while the human cost beneath it faded into obscurity. History is often written by those who held power, and in Athens, power belonged exclusively to free men. Their writings shaped what was remembered and what was discarded. Philosophers spoke endlessly of virtue, yet rarely questioned a system that treated women as expendable tools. Lawmakers praised order while enforcing laws that protected property over human life. Poets immortalized heroes while ignoring the countless women whose bodies were consumed to sustain the city's pleasures and profits. Over time, this selective memory became tradition. Roman scholars inherited Greek admiration. Renaissance thinkers revived classical ideals. Modern education systems echoed the same narrative. Each generation polished the image further until the suffering of enslaved women became an uncomfortable footnote, if it was mentioned at all. Yet silence does not equal absence. The ground remembers what books omit. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal fractures in the classical myth, unmarked graves, bones bearing unmistakable signs of long-term abuse, objects discarded with human remains. These findings contradict the idea of a humane and enlightened society. They tell a story written not in ink, but in flesh and bone. The tragedy of these women lies not only in what they endured, but in how completely they were denied recognition afterward. They were denied justice in life, dignity in death, and memory in history. Even mourning was forbidden to them. No inscriptions, no rituals, no names passed down. To be forgotten was the final act of violence, and yet remembering them today carries meaning. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Civilization can coexist with cruelty, and progress does not automatically bring compassion. Athens was capable of producing great art and great injustice at the same time. This contradiction is not unique to the ancient world. It is a pattern repeated throughout history. By examining these hidden lives, we do not diminish the achievements of the past. We humanize them. We acknowledge that greatness built on suffering is incomplete, that democracy without inclusion is fragile, that culture without empathy is hollow. These women were not symbols. They were individuals, daughters, captives, children, each with a voice that history chose not to hear. Their lives mattered, even if the world they lived in refused to recognize it. To remember them now is an act of restoration, not of justice that came too late, but of truth. And truth, once spoken, cannot be erased as easily as stone inscriptions or forgotten graves.